Well, our first little case study, just to highlight the importance of having a good plan and a good strategy, is to look at the American War in Vietnam. Now, this is obviously a historical war. It was fought between 65 and 75, and was a contest between, at the time, was a very economically underdeveloped peasant economy, simply that had recently been a colony of France, but had driven the French out. And on the other side was the most powerful country on earth, the most powerful military on earth, and surely this could only have one outcome. But the people who were fighting the war had clearly different ideas of what the way about it, clear different understandings of it. And that's why it's a good thing to understand how powerful strategy can be. And it's also because it's showing that it's in the public sector. Uh, and Pham Van Dong, who's the Vietnamese PM after the end of the war, North Vietnamese thing, said, commented at the time, the US is the most powerful nation on earth, but they don't like inconclusive wars. We can outlast them and win in the end. The reality was the North Vietnamese recognised that actually they simply had to survive for long enough for the Americans to become depressed and lose interest in fighting the war and withdraw. Okay, so they adopted something called the GIAP strategy. Now, GIAP was a student of Sun Tzu, who was one of, considered to be the original strategist, the guy who first wrote the first book on strategy, and he reckoned there were four main things that he isolated things. Okay, first that he realised that actually he needed to unify North Vietnam. For that reason, although he himself was a communist, he didn't require actually everyone fighting against the Americans to be communists. He realized that actually a more general nationalist presence at the beginning of the war would be more effective. That would unite people together. The US itself actually had various numbers of objectives and sub-objectives. Was it fighting to free Vietnam? It did say that publicly, but other people said it was the domino theory. It's just trying to teach a lesson to the communists that they'd be less banned. At this time, there was a fear that if Vietnam fell, then other countries would fall around it. And though that there were other people who actually believed they were propping up the South Vietnamese government because it was a good thing, others thought the South Vietnamese government was a bad thing itself, but actually they wanted unification. And there's all these different sub-objectives, no objectives, tended to get in the way of one another. Gayap also understood his environment. And environment we mean, and this is something that's very important if you're doing strategy, you have to understand your environment. And by that I mean something much broader than just green issues, other things. He had to understand, for instance, he understood that America had political problems, that there's a lot of resistance to American intervention overseas, that there'd be resistance to the war, and so he should take advantage of that. He also understood more than the Americans the nature of the South Vietnamese battlefields. The Americans often committed heavy armor, tanks, that sort of thing, to battlefields, though it was inappropriate. And he understood the public perceptions were very important. That across the world, if he could get people on the south side of the North Vietnamese, he could get them to think of the Americans as the aggressor, this would be very good. Also, it's important that the Vietnamese people saw the North Vietnam government as their unifier, as the people who come to rescue them. So he understood this, and these are all elements of their environment. He also understood the importance of the resources, even though that he knew that his troops' army equipment was inferior, but he knew that they were more loyal because they were actually at home. They saw themselves defending their country, and therefore they had a high morale doing that. And it's important for the effectiveness. Giap had to realise that he took responsibility for his decisions. So he's often sadly lacking management these days. And he made the difficult decisions, he made the difficult calls and never hid from them. And in doing so, he actually fostered strong loyalty and commitment among his subordinates. And these were elements that sort of the McClure, writing shortly after the end of the Vietnamese War, was able to comment on the level of effectiveness of them. Okay, so what was the result? Well, according to Sun Tzu, this is that the greatest victory you can achieve is if the enemy gives up. And in the case of Vietnam, although they struggled to win any battles, in the end, the US gave up and went home. And in fact, even as recently as 2006, in publications I was following, the US Army was still arguing that they had never lost a battle in Vietnam. But the reality is, it doesn't matter how many battles you don't lose, they lost the war. In many ways, this became known as the First MBA War. On the US side, it was the first time that large numbers of the universities graduates with MBAs were actually leading and organising the war. And the US actually famously had a lot of computer models that told them that they were winning right all the way through. But of course, this was because they were measuring the wrong thing. And you may have heard the famous quote around Afghanistan, in which the American general said, "We don't do body counts." That sounded very callous, but actually that was because they had learned during the Vietnam War that body counts, where they said, "Oh, we've killed so many of the enemy," are not relevant. in a situation where the enemy, in a way, can afford to lose many more troops than you can lose. So in this case situation, the Americans were counting the wrong thing. They didn't understand what they were measuring. They were under the impression they were losing, and they were winning right up to the point where they lost. And of course, this is very much along the Mao Zedong three-stage strategy, which has proved very successful in guerrilla wars. But it only really functions, though, and this is something to remember when people try to apply one theory elsewhere, is that the enemy had somewhere to go. In Vietnam, the American could withdraw, but it was not effective elsewhere. So a lot of people took the Mao Zedong's three-stage strategy, which had been successful in China, was successful in Vietnam, and said, "Oh, let's try and apply this elsewhere." But of course, and this is one of the problems we see with strategy, that we see where people are applying models that have worked in one area in completely other areas. And one of the big examples of that, much of Latin America, it failed, with the exception of Cuba, where the people who were defeated in Cuba, they retreated into the US. And we can see what's happening in Afghanistan and Iraq. There's been Afghanistan a certain level of success, but in Iraq again, there's an ongoing struggle, ongoing problems. The country does not seem to be settling down or stabilizing. Over this course, we're going to be looking at a large number of models. I think it's important to recognise that. So we're looking at like Swaston, Tozer, Mazin, Azridge, and Five Forces. And these are all important, but the really important part of strategy is what we've just talked about, which is being able to set clear objectives and understand your environment. So are these models important? Yes, they are in some ways, but actually the specific models you choose are not important. As part of your assignment, you'll talk about the models you use, why you used them, what thought you was good about them, what you thought was bad about them. Also, hopefully, you'll talk about some of the models you don't use and why you chose to reject them. Okay. So what matters is the process, and this is more important than the actual model you picked. And this fact is not just lost on students, it's often lost on many management consultants. A consultant, by the way, is a phrase when it comes to management consultants. It's taken from the original Anglo-Saxon, a unifier of to con and insult. And the phrase that I often use, and you'll hear me use this thing, is all models are wrong, but some models are useful. A phrase that is actually originally given to statistician George Box. So to do good strategy, all you actually need are clear visions, clear mission, clear objectives, understand yourself, understand your opposition, and you'll succeed. And these are, like I say, this teaching goes all the way back to Sun Tzu, about 600 BC. So it's not necessarily particularly new, but its usage has become new, and in fact it's re-emerged. The assignment going to be set on this is reflective and critical. So an essay on what strategy is. So it's not just a how-to guide to applying tools. In many ways, it's not so much a report as an essay, a straightforward academic essay. You're writing things about how you'll do things. So it's a very important that you understand why you're doing things, not just what you're doing.